Chapter 4 of your textbook concerns civil liberties, which are the individual rights that U.S. citizens possess. When the United States Constitution was ratified, there was a widespread concern that the Constitution did not protect individual rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. I should point out that most states already had their own bills of rights. The fear was that a national government would trample on rights that citizens possessed under their state constitutions. And so the first Congress enacted a Bill of Rights and sent it to the states for ratification. Most actions of the U.S. government draw judicial scrutiny. That is, they get challenged in a court very often. The Supreme Court of the United States is the Court of Final Appeals. It has played a pivotal role in defining rights and liberties in the 20th century. So let's start with the first part of the First Amendment, which concerns religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Therefore, the government cannot make an official religion and cannot prevent people from worshiping their own religion. Now, if you ever go to Washington, D.C. and visit the Capitol building, you might notice that Congress starts every session with a prayer, and they will invite a religious leader in to lead them in prayer at the start of every session. This does not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, because they always invite a different religious leader. That is, they might invite a Catholic priest to lead them in prayer, followed by a Buddhist monk, followed by a Baptist minister, followed by a Muslim imam. In 1971, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in Lemon v. Kurtzman. Any law concerning a religion must have a secular or worldly purpose. It can neither advance nor inhibit the practice of religion, and it cannot excessively entangle government in the religion itself. That is, the government should never become involved in doctrinal questions, like Trinity doctrine in the Catholic Church, for example. This became known as strict separation. That is, a complete separation between government and religion. However, after the Affordable Care Act, the Hobby Lobby company sued regarding the Obamacare's requirement that they provide birth control to their employees. The Hobby Lobby company is privately owned by a very religious family, and they claimed that this requirement that they provide birth control to their employees violated their First Amendment right to the free practice of religion. The Supreme Court agreed with Hobby Lobby that the Affordable Care Act violated their religious rights. That has become known as accommodation of religion. The second part of the First Amendment concerns speech and expression. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Freedom of speech holds a preferred position in front of a court. That is to say, if the government wants to prevent speech from occurring, they had better have a very convincing reason. Nonverbal expression is also protected by the First Amendment. Examples of nonverbal expression include the visual and performing arts, including music, and even your haircut and the clothes that you wear. Those are all part of your freedom of expression. The government could not pass a law requiring that every person shave their head, for example. That would violate your freedom of expression. Having said all of that, does an employer who requires a dress code violate your right to free expression? The answer is no, because you have the freedom to quit your job and find another job. That's called at-will employment. If you choose to work for a certain employer, you are also choosing to follow their dress code and their code of conduct. So, what about if the government is your employer? Well, then your employer still has the right to require a dress code. For example, the United States Postal Service requires blue uniforms, while the Forest Service, or rather the National Park Service, requires green uniforms. Now, there is some speech that is not protected by the First Amendment. Speech which creates a clear and present danger is not protected by the First Amendment. The classic example of this is yelling fire in a crowded theater. Yelling fire in a crowded theater could cause a stampede and could cause people to be injured. Furthermore, some states will allow fighting words as a defense in court. Alabama is one such state. And so in those states, there are certain phrases that are meant to provoke a fight. That's why they're called fighting words. Commercial speech is not protected by the First Amendment because commercial speech is intended to make money. Wherever there is the intent to make money, there is the possibility of fraud. And one of the reasons why we have government in the first place, if you recall Chapter 1, is to prevent fraud. Libel is writing something about someone that is untrue and malicious and intended to harm them. Libel is not protected by the First Amendment. Now, there is an exception. Public figures like the President of the United States are not protected. It is considered foundational to democracy to be able to criticize the people who rule over you. And so, during the Obama administration, there were many people who went around claiming that President Obama was not a U.S. citizen. These people could not be penalized by the government for stating that belief about the president. Likewise, during the Trump administration, there are a large number of people who claim that Trump is nothing more than Vladimir Putin's puppet. Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia. Those people, again, cannot be penalized for stating that political belief because your political expression is protected by the First Amendment. Obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. The Miller test is a means of determining whether or not something is obscene. In order to be obscene, it must be sexually stimulating, patently offensive, and lacking artistic, political, literary, or scientific value. So, for example, if someone were to paint an extremely unflattering portrait of the President of the United States in the nude, that would not be considered obscene. That is a form of political expression. Take a look at this image, which was posted in a hospital. Is this image obscene? Take a good, close look. The answer is no. This image is not obscene for several reasons. First of all, it's not a particularly realistic portrayal of the human body. And second, and most importantly, it does actually serve a scientific and educational purpose. This image is attempting to demonstrate the right and wrong way to take a baby's temperature. Prior restraint is a legal effort to stop speech before it occurs. Censorship, for example. The Supreme Court has not allowed the national government to do this yet. So, for example, the Pentagon Papers, which were classified documents that concerned U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Cambodia, were published, and the publisher of those papers was not penalized. Likewise, WikiLeaks has published video, classified video of U.S. operations in Iraq. And Edward Snowden revealed classified operations of the National Security Agency. The newspapers and other media outlets which published Snowden's claims were not punished because of the First Amendment. Moving on to the Second Amendment, which concerns gun ownership, the United States has 88 guns per 100 residents, more than any other country in the world. The U.S. also has 3.2 gun-related homicides per 100,000 people. The Second Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States as an individual right binding on the states. The Second Amendment makes reference to a militia. However, the Supreme Court ruled that it was an individual right, not a militia right. Likewise, I should point out that when the Bill of Rights was first ratified, not every state ratified the Second Amendment, but 3/4 of the states did, and so it became part of the Constitution. The U.S. is the only nation in the world that guarantees gun rights. What is the reasoning why a right to gun ownership? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, it is considered traditional for Americans, particularly in rural areas, to be able to hunt and fish. Rifles are very commonly used in hunting. Likewise, traditionally, we have a right to defend ourselves, particularly when we are in our own homes. Your home is your castle, and you have a right to defend your castle. And then finally, the reasoning is that an armed civilian population can prevent a government from becoming too tyrannical. Many people claim that the government and its military are too powerful for basically private citizens to overcome. However, my rebuttal to those people is to point out that the Viet Cong did a very good job of resisting the U.S. government during the 1960s and 70s, even though they were outgunned. If you ever take a U.S. history class, you will probably learn about the rights revolution in the 1960s. Before the 1960s, the Supreme Court would instruct lower courts on criminal procedure. For example, the Supreme Court would tell lower courts what could be admitted as evidence and what size the jury had to be, in particular in capital cases. Rarely did the Supreme Court actually instruct the police on how to conduct investigations before the 1960s. Later in the 1960s, the Supreme Court began telling the police how to conduct investigations, in particular the investigation and interview process. For example, if you are ever interviewed in a police station by the police, they cannot have more than 2 armed officers in the interview room with you at the same time. The Supreme Court also became concerned about the rights of people who have been convicted of crimes and incarcerated. And the Supreme Court began to look at issues like overcrowding and other conditions of incarceration. The Supreme Court also became concerned with the rights of the accused. Procedural due process is one example. The authorities must follow the law when investigating. Consequently, the police cannot torture a person into confessing to a crime. That confession is thrown out of court. That's called the exclusionary rule. Evidence obtained illegally, like a confession that has been beaten out of a person, can and will be thrown out. The police cannot perform a search without a warrant or probable cause. However, I should point out that we have different expectations of privacy when we are in public, which is where we have the lowest expectation of privacy. When you're in your car, where you have slightly more of an expectation of privacy. And then when you are in your home, you have your highest expectation of privacy. Typically, the police need a warrant to enter your home unless there is clear and obvious evidence that a crime is being committed. So, for example, if they look through your living room window and see a mountain of cocaine, then that might be considered probable cause. Or if someone is screaming that they're being murdered inside your home, that could also be considered probable cause. In Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that an accused person must be informed of their rights when arrested. This became the Miranda warning. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, etc. In Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, the Supreme Court ruled that anyone who faces incarceration more than 1 year in prison has the right to an attorney, and if they can't afford one, an attorney must be provided for them. This happened after a man was convicted for burglarizing a bar. Gideon could not afford an attorney, and he had to represent himself in the trial. And he was convicted and sentenced to a number of years of prison. While in prison, he hand-wrote an appeal which made it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in his favor that he should have been provided with an attorney because the term of incarceration that he was looking at was greater than 1 year. You also have the right to at least one appeal if you are convicted of a crime. An appeal is when another court looks at your case. The Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. A punishment can be cruel or it can be unusual, but it cannot be both. Does the Constitution allow the death penalty? The answer is yes, it does. The death penalty is unquestionably cruel, but it's not particularly unusual. If you pick up a history book, the death penalty goes back to Hammurabi's Code, which was thousands of years ago. Moreover, the death penalty is still practiced by a large number of nations throughout the world. The militarization of the police is a phenomenon that has occurred over the last couple decades. Here you see a suburban Illinois county has purchased an armored personnel carrier. It is debatable about whether or not a county in the Chicago suburbs needs a vehicle like this. Police departments throughout the country have also been acquiring assault weapons and so forth. That is the militarization of the police, and it's a very recent phenomenon. Here we see incarceration rates. Even though this data is more than 10 years old, it's still accurate. If you look at this chart, you see that for every 100,000 residents, Canada has incarcerated 116 people, while England and Wales have incarcerated 153 people per 100,000 residents. The United States is the outlier. The United States has incarcerated 753 people per 100,000 residents. That is more per capita than any other country in the world. Why does the U.S. lock up so many more people than other countries? There are several ways to answer this question. It's a debate not just in political science, but also in other fields like sociology, economics, history, criminal justice, and even psychology. From the perspective of a political scientist, one of the most important reasons recalls Chapter 3 in your textbook on federalism. Federalism, if you recall, is when you have a national government and subnational units. So in the United States, we have a national government that locks people up. We have 50 state governments that lock people up. And we have thousands of cities and counties and towns and villages that also lock people up. Therefore, in the U.S., there are several different entities that are investigating and prosecuting crimes at any given time. Take a look at this graph. You notice here that beginning in the 1970s, the number of people in jail or prison in the United States rose exponentially. We went from about 500,000 people incarcerated in 1980 to over 2 million people incarcerated by the time of the 2010 census. One of the main reasons for this is the war on drugs. Both Republicans and Democrats wanted to appear tough on crime. Sometimes it was almost like an arms race to see who could enact stiffer sentences for criminals. For example, in 1994, President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, signed a very harsh crime bill that in particular penalized drug traffickers. Collectively, the United States has made a decision to treat drug use and abuse like a crime instead of an illness. There are some countries in the world that treat drug use like it's an illness. Portugal and the Netherlands are two examples. Are attitudes changing? You could argue that yes, attitudes are changing. Several states have legalized recreational cannabis. And the Trump administration and Congress enacted a prison reform bill that lightened the sentences for some non-violent drug crimes. The war on terror began after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Domestic surveillance historically always required a warrant. However, we now know from Edward Snowden's revelations that the National Security Agency collects bulk data regarding phone calls and internet use. The United States prohibits aid to terrorist groups. What then constitutes aid? The most obvious example is leaving the United States and joining a terrorist group, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The Obama administration used drone strikes to kill 3 U.S. citizens outside the United States who had joined with terrorist groups and were actively plotting to conduct attacks against the United States.